Hi everybody, I'm Dinkle the Elf and this is Secrets from Santa's Library. How you doing all today? Alright, today I'm going to read you the story of the Iron King. It's about that railroad that goes through the North Pole, how it got built and where it came from. You know the one I'm talking about. I don't have to say it, do I? No, I'm not going to. Alright, alright, so here we go. It was the middle of June. Summer in certain parts of the world. The North Pole has its seasons too, even in Santa's magic realm, and the melting snow was heavy and wet and slushy. Nothing made to navigate the snow was working. I was there. Skis, sleighs, and snowmobiles were useless. The conditions were intolerable. Even the usually jolly elves were miserable. Off-season toy production was at an all-time low. Now Santa decided to give everyone, the entire North Pole staff, 2 months off. Even Santa and Mrs. Claus decided to visit Spain, and so, except for Dinkle the Elf, that's me, and Blitzen the reindeer, the entire pole was abandoned. Dinkle loved these rare occasions when no one else was around because it gave him time to fix, well, everything. You see, Dinkle was a fixer, a tinkerer and a putterer. Just because something works doesn't mean it can't be improved. Dinkle had no problem filling his days with activity. Every morning he went to the reindeer pen to feed Blitzen. Then he'd open the pen and Blitzen would usually follow Dinkle from job to job. He spent the entirety of the last week tweaking and improving all the machines in the toy manufacturing hall. Today they were headed for the garage, where all of Santa's sleighs were kept. First on his list was an entire overhaul and tightening of the undercarriage and running irons of old Red Sleigh 1, Santa's very first sleigh, and his favorite. Blitzen was walking just ahead of Dinkle towards the garage. Blitzen stopped, snorted, put his head up, and started snorting and bellowing while striking the ground with his hoof. Dinkle came up beside Blitzen and examined the ground in front of them. It was hard to make out in the mud and sludge and snow, but Dinkle was sure there were footprints. Tiny footprints coming out of the forest and leading to the garage. Dinkle ran towards the garage, and as he came closer to it, he could see the door was askew and off its hinges. He was running so fast that when he tried to stop, with all the mud and sludge on the ground, he overbalanced and face-planted at the base of the door. Yeah, wasn't fun. Blitzen came up behind Dinkle and gave him an encouraging nudge to the backside. Dinkle turned over in the mud and sat up to face Blitzen, who was licking his face. "Thanks, Blitzen," said Dinkle dryly, while grabbing Blitzen by the collar as he stood up. Dinkle then turned around to face the broken door to the garage. He looked down to see more tiny footprints, then grabbed the broken door to move it aside and walked in. Red Sleigh 1 was gone. Missing, stolen. Red Sleigh 2 was smashed and broken. Sleigh number 3, known as Old Blue, was sitting upside down, and its sleigh rails missing, its sled, its skis. Santa and Mrs. Claus had taken the 4th sleigh, Lola, with them to Spain. Gold 5, known as Goldie, sat miraculously untouched. Dinkle stood staring around the room at the broken sleighs. There were tiny footprints everywhere, except near Gold 5. Then he noticed the walls. All the ironwork was gone. The sconces, the handles, Old Blue's rails had been iron. Red Sleigh 2, shattered and broken, had been built using a wood iron lapping technique to better endure extreme weather. In fact, the only thing untouched was Goldie, Santa's very special solid gold sleigh. Given to him by King Midas himself, by the way. Whoever was responsible obviously wasn't interested in gold, just iron. Dinkle looked back to where Red Sleigh 1 had been. That's when he noticed the ruts in the mud were twice as deep as the ruts under Goldie, twice as deep as the solid gold sleigh. All the iron had been loaded into Red Sleigh 1, but the ruts didn't go anywhere. Nor could it have been dragged through the sludge, not the snow and the mud. The sleigh had been removed some other way, and the iron with it. This fact gave Dinkle a small but growing hope of seeing Red Sleigh 1 again. After all, it was Santa's first sleigh and was mostly wood. It was unlikely that we'd take her apart, whoever they were. That was the question, who were they? How did they get the sleigh out, and what did they need the iron for? "Hey, Blitzen!" exclaimed Dinkle, turning towards the reindeer. "Who needs iron?" Blitzen put his nose to the nose with Elf and stared straight at me in a mock look of frustration. Then Blitzen looked straight down and tapped his hoof right at Dinkle's feet. Dinkle looked down right at the tiny footprints he had noticed earlier. "Gnomes! Of course! Gnomes!" repeated Dinkle, sounding half relieved. The gnomes of the North Forest were long known to be the best ironsmiths around. It is said the morning mist of the North Forest is caused by the forges of the gnomes. When in large numbers, they could summon great magic, enough to float the sleigh out of the garage. "Thanks, Blitzen. Well, they shouldn't be hard to find, but why would they want to steal iron from Santa? Usually they mine their own. What in the world could they be building? Let's go see, Blitzen." Dinkle and Blitzen set off for the forest and the north to seek out the gnomes. They slipped and slid as they left their mud-soaked streets of Christmas Village. As the trees grew thicker, the ground beneath their feet became more solid, and they soon found themselves in the center of the forest. Blitzen stopped suddenly and ducked behind a bush. Dinkle crouched next to the reindeer. "Yeah, I hear it too, Blitzen. Forges. Hundreds of them. Possibly thousands. I've never heard of its like before. Come on, let's get closer. After all, they're only gnomes." They stepped out from between the bushes and started walking towards the sound of the forges. As the sound grew louder, the terrain grew steeper, and they soon realized they were in the mountains that ring the Great North Forest. They reached the edge of a great clearing in a high valley. Before them stretched a sight Dinkle had never seen before. Two great ribbons of iron running parallel into the distance, disappearing into an enormous cave. A railroad. He had, of course, heard of a railroad, but he had never seen one, and that wasn't all. The valley was thick with the smoke of over 300 gnomish forges. Trees were being felled in the distance, 30 at a time. An enormous steam engine could be seen peeking out of the entrance to the cave. There were thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of gnomes, everywhere, doing everything. They were building a railroad. An awesome one at that. It was 3 times the size of a human-built steam engine. As Dinkle took in the extent of the operation, it dawned on him just what it was he was witness to. This was the great clan of the gnomes, seen only once, and only in legend. These were the Iron Gnomes, the master clan, the clan from which all other clans of gnomes derive. No one believes it. No one believes it exists. No one, not even the gnomes, would admit to it. "Blitzen, do you know what this is?" Dinkle said excitedly. Blitzen was shaking his head no, not because he didn't know, but in an attempt to stop Dinkle from what he was about to do. Dinkle stepped out into the open, but Blitzen was hanging back just at the tree line. Dinkle grabbed Blitzen by the collar, trying to pull him forward. Blitzen was pulling back and snorting. Then suddenly the two of them were beset upon by gnomes. Gnomes were falling from the trees, gnomes were popping up out of the ground, and gnomes were swinging in from ropes. It seemed to Blitzen that there were a billion gnomes, but it was really several hundred that had managed to subdue them both. Completely covered in gnomes to the point of being blinded by them, they were carried into a room and left standing bound in ropes before an enormous iron platform with a tiny iron throne at the very top. Sitting upon the throne was an ancient-looking gnome, of still rather impressive stature for his apparent age and size. Dressed in luminous blues and bright reds and orange, the colors of iron in a forge, this was the Iron King, ruler of all gnomes and the innards of the earth. Dinkle looked over at Blitzen, whose rear hooves were tied close together and to the wall. Plus, there was a rope from the wall to his collar. Dinkle's hands were tied behind his back and tied loosely by a rope to the wall. Dinkle made a bowing motion at Blitzen, and Blitzen extended his front legs outward and bowed his head. Dinkle, with his head down, said, "All hail the Iron King! I bring greetings from the North Pole!" For a moment, all was silent. Then the great gnome king leaned forward. Looking down at Dinkle and Blitzen, he glared and said, "Why have you come here, Master Elf? Who sent you?" Dinkle had not prepared himself for a hostile greeting, and found himself looking to Blitzen for ideas. The reindeer, of course, was really no help at all, and just snorted back in Dinkle's general direction. "I am Master Dinkle of the North Pole. I'm one of Santa's elves, and this is Blitzen, one of Santa's reindeer. We came hoping you could help us with a matter of missing sleigh." Dinkle hoped he had said that with appropriate diplomacy. The Iron King held up his hand, and the gathering throng of gnomes fell silent. The Iron King then spoke. "Everyone has heard of Blitzen. You and your elf servant are most welcome." "Oh, thank you," interjected Dinkle, who was promptly cut off by the king. "Silence, elf. I was addressing Master Blitzen. Now untie them. We must treat Master Blitzen as our guests." Dinkle and Blitzen were staring at each other. Dinkle shrugged his shoulders to indicate a "just go with it" signal to Blitzen, who, looking back at Dinkle, was less sure of the situation and was shaking his head no at Dinkle. The Iron King spoke. "Master Blitzen, it would be my honor if you would join us for a meal. We have the finest in fresh corn." With the words meal and corn, the king immediately had Blitzen's attention. Blitzen snorted and nodded his head in agreement, to which the king continued. "Please escort Master Blitzen and his elf to the dining room. Once seated, call lunch, and I shall join you all shortly." With that, a gnome dressed in dark silvery robes and a tall oval hat escorted Blitzen and Dinkle into a large dining hall. Large, that is, by gnomish standards. With a table that was nearly 50 feet long but nearly 2 feet wide. The chair where Blitzen would sit, to the king's left, near the end of the table, had been moved down one space so that Dinkle could have 2 chairs to fit in. Blitzen, of course, didn't need a chair. Once they were seated comfortably at the table, the little gnome went off blowing a horn as he went, and disappeared through a set of double doors. Soon the double doors flew open again, and hundreds of tiny gnomes filled in along the table and took their places in the grand but narrow dining hall. The room was filled with noise and chatter as gnomes carried on with conversations back and forth across the table. All fell silent when a small door near the end of the room opened and the Iron King made his entrance, followed closely by the gnome in the oval hat, obviously the king's assistant. His assistant pulled out the king's chair, and the greatness that was the Iron King sat down. Suddenly, servants by the dozens filled the room, placing piles of food on the table, like some form of manic dance. It was over, and the servants were gone. Everyone at the table was waiting and watching the king before starting to eat, and everyone except for Blitzen, who was unaware of the custom and was already on his 3rd corn on the cob. The Iron King stared at Blitzen for a moment, then started to laugh. The entire table broke out in laughter with him, and everyone began to eat. While they were eating, Dinkle took advantage of the talkative nature of the gnome seated to his left, an older gnome named Gurgle, who enjoyed drinking and boasting about the greatness of the Iron Clan. Dinkle learned several important things. 1. Red Sleigh 1 was nearby, and in one piece. 2. The Iron Clan was claiming the endless iron fields of the north for themselves because they feared the humans were mining all the iron from the rest of the world. 3. The railroad would not only connect both hemispheres of the world, but would magically connect to all the human railroads, allowing travel anywhere there were tracks, and several places that there weren't any tracks. And 4. The mining through the thick rock of these granite mountains was taking its toll on the resources and mining skills of even the mighty Iron Clan. All the information he had heard stirred an idea in his head, which he hoped would help the gnomes and smooth things over with Santa. Now, Dinkle knew that he himself was not a favorite of the king, so by the time they finished lunch, Dinkle had convinced Gurgle that Gurgle himself had come up with the idea. As the Iron King was about to call a halt to lunch, Gurgle the gnome stood up upon his chair and asked to be recognized to speak. The king gave a nod and Gurgle began. that is to say, I have been talking with my friend here, indicating Dinkle, and I've come up with an idea that will save both time and labor and require only a fraction of the tunneling. As he paused for effect, Gurgle could tell the king was intrigued. He continued, if we realign our tracks to true north, from here we can cut the track build by half, using only half the iron that we had originally estimated, by going right over the North Pole. We would go right through Christmas Village, right down Santa's main street, and through just 200 more feet of mountain on the other side. A cheer went up along both sides of the table, and the Iron King was looking very pleased when Gurgle motioned and called for quiet, and then said, in exchange for... There was total silence. In exchange for building several stops, and providing passenger service for the elves in the morning and in the morning and evening every day, and one special night a year, every Christmas Eve. We would run a special service special passengers who have earned the privilege to see the North Pole and Santa's village, and then returning them home before morning. All remained silent. The Iron King was standing and was looking directly at Gurgle with a very stern expression and perhaps a bit of a frown. Suddenly a smile seemed to slide across the Iron King's face, and he began to laugh. The room began to ring with his laughter. This, he said, pointing to Gurgle, is the wisest gnome I've ever known. With that, a wave of applause and laughter made its way across the room. We shall honor you at dinner tonight, Elder Gurgle, but now lunch is over and we must get back to work. Everyone, you know the plan. As the king was speaking, Dinkle, sitting next to Blitzen, cleared his throat to get the king's attention. Oh, great and glorious Iron King, Blitzen has informed me of a deadline. Dinkle had suddenly remembered how soon Santa Claus and the other elves would return, and it occurred to him that if it was already there, it would be easier to explain to Santa. The king gave Dinkle a stern look, then turned toward Blitzen and asked, how long do we have? Blitzen turned his head to look at Dinkle equally as sternly as the king had. Dinkle leaned in next to Blitzen's ear and whispered, tell him 2 weeks. Blitzen now looked quizzically at Dinkle, who then said, I don't know, count 15 with your hooves or something. Blitzen gave Dinkle a very you owe me a big time sort of look, then turned back to the Iron King, nodded, struck 15 with his hoof, then snorted and nodded at the Iron King. The Iron King looked at Blitzen, smiled, and said, you heard the reindeer, we have 15 days, let's go, let's build. You iron gnomes, let's build. And with that, the room was empty, except for the Iron King, Blitzen, Dinkle, and Gurgle. Gurgle was talking to Dinkle, who was actually watching the Iron King carry on what seemed a deep philosophical conversation with Blitzen, who was responding with a nod, a shake, a snort. And the king seemed perfectly fine with it. Dinkle was able to make one more deal with Gurgle to make sure the Red Sleigh 1 would be brought back to the pole first train. To see the Iron Gnomes in action was truly a magnificent sight, and it was only 11 days before the gnomes had reached the North Pole. Not without a little creative help from Dinkle, who had helped the gnomes move half the town 10 feet to the south to make room for the train tracks down Main Street. On the 12th day, the very first steam locomotive, built by the clan of the Iron Gnomes, rolled into Main Street Station, officially called Santa's Workshop Station. And on the very first flat car sat Red Sleigh 1, finally back at the North Pole. Inside it, the rails for sleigh number 3, Old Blue. It took a little time to put Red Sleigh 1 back in the garage, and by the end of the day, all the iron from the garage had been replaced as well, and Old Blue had been repaired and uprighted. It took 2 more days to complete the cleanup of the town and tracks, but by the day 15, the elves started rolling in from vacation. Everything looked just like it had when they left, except for a wider Main Street with a shiny new gnome-built steam engine, named appropriately the Iron King, sitting stately on the tracks in front of Santa's toy workshop. As the elves first arrived, there was a lot of standing around and pointing and muttering. Then the muttering increased in volume as the elves began to realize their homes had been moved. It was then that Santa and Mrs. Claus and Lola, as well as the rest of the reindeer, came flying in. Dinkle gave the gnome engineer a signal, and the steam engine's whistle exploded into sound. The noise caused Santa to circle twice before landing on Main Street, right next to the giant mass of iron and chrome known as the Iron King. Dinkle was right there to meet Santa, and he stepped out of the sleigh. The murmuring of the elves dropped off, and everyone was waiting for Santa's reaction. Santa Claus tapped Dinkle on the shoulder and whispered, "I'll be back in a minute." Then Santa took his time, wandered around the massive engine, surveyed the town, looked down the track both directions, then walked back to Dinkle. Santa Claus put his hands on both of Dinkle's shoulders, leaned into him. Their eyes locked for just a moment, and Dinkle was still unclear what Santa was thinking. Then Santa hoisted Dinkle up on his shoulder, holding him with one hand, while his other was raised in celebration and accomplishment. A cheer went up from the elves and gnomes. Santa Claus himself paraded Dinkle up and down Main Street for at least half an hour. Well, all was said and done at Santa's workshop station. A statue was installed, forever commemorating the contribution, inventiveness, and ingenuity of Dinkle and Blitzen. Right? Wasn't that a fun story? Well, there's the statue. Yes, Blitzen really is that big. He's a good-sized reindeer. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that edition of Secrets from Santa's Library. Now you know. We'll see you next time. Merry Christmas from the North Pole. Bye-bye.